Let's face the facts. File breakage during chemomechanical instrumentation is a pain in the... There are a plethora of tools and devices to manage these types of procedural accidents, however, and you can use your Tarucci kit, your Endo Cowboy, the Ruddle, the Masseran kit, the Johnson kit. So many different types of tools are available, and these tools all try to remove the separated instrument for us, and you can also manage it surgically if the instrument is beyond direct sight. You can also leave it in place if the risk of removing it outweighs the risk of leaving it alone. Leaving it in place, how can that be possible? Well, in the next 5 shorts videos, let's take a look at the etiology of file separation and factors for success and failure. Look, if you are rotating any metallic instrument in a confined space around a curvature, it will exert 2 types of forces on that instrument that could lead to failure: torsion and flexion. If there are any of these 2 types of forces and they exceed the metal's yield point, the instrument will break. This type of failure results from excessive torque or cyclic fatigue. Torque is the pressure exerted on the instrument body by the dentinal walls, and cyclic fatigue happens by a back and forth bending of the instrument around the curve, causing metal failure. Files break from torque if they're forced down a narrower path than they can manage and based on their rake angle and chip space size. They break from cyclic fatigue if you overuse them multiple times. The rate of fracture is reported in the literature to be around 1 to 6%. So the rate is low and it can be kept lower with good practices. The best way to avoid a fracture, however, is to avoid multiple use and never force a file in the canal. Use a new file passively and remove debris frequently through frequent irrigation. Next, we'll talk about prognostic factors after fracture. Since the incidence of file separation is only around 1 to 6%, what should we do when it happens? Hang ourselves? No! Luckily, a recent meta-analysis of literature showed no significant difference in clinical outcomes after file separation. The main problem with a file separation is not the fact that a file broke, it's that the canal is now blocked and that impedes cleaning and shaping beyond the broken instrument. So when it happens and in what kind of a canal it happens is an important prognostic factor. The prognosis is likely worse if it happens early in the necrotic canal with a large lesion that is not bypassable, which leaves a distal portion of that canal untouched and uninstrumented. But the same situation under aseptic conditions in a non-necrotic tooth will not be quite as bad. It is also better if it happens later during the cleaning and shaping process, or if it happens to a larger file after some initial cleaning has already been done with smaller instruments. Basically, the concept here is how much disinfection has already been done before you blocked out of the rest of the canal. And the cleaner there is before it breaks, the better the prognosis. Again, we should aim to avoid file separation by all means by using good techniques and developing good habits rather than deal with its consequences when it happens. In the next short, let's talk about what to do when a file separation. If you separate a file or if you run into a separated file, you need to assess the prognosis based on the factors that I explained in the previous video. But once the prognosis is determined, what do you do about it? If you are a general dentist, well, referral to an endodontist is always the ideal situation for a medical legal point of view, since you have covered your bases for appropriate management by a specialist. Attempting to remove the file always appears easier when done by some guru at a podium. For the rest of us mortals, it's really a multi-hour feat of frustration at best, or a total destruction of the tooth structure at worst. Be wise and refer when it's needed. Otherwise, whenever possible, it's best to follow up and monitor the tooth versus attempting aggressive attempts at removal. If the separation occurs above the curve and if the instrument is visible under the microscope, non-surgical attempt at removal using microsurgical techniques and ultrasonics at removal kits may be helpful in many of these situations. And if the breakage is around the curve and the instrument is not visible under the scope, any attempt at its removal has a higher chance of further damaging the root by additional ledging, perforation, or thinning of the remaining structure, or worse, push the instrument deeper in the canal. So a decision for surgical removal versus observation is always an important decision to be made. Surgery is predictable but limited to areas where vital structures don't add additional risks to surgery. Next, let's talk about what to say to the patient when it happens. File separation is rare, and it can be made even more rare by sensible use of instruments and limiting instrument reuse. By the way, little known fact is that the FDA recently released a white paper requiring endophiles to be single-use instruments. This aims to reduce cross-contamination, but also helps reduce instrument fracture. Of course, it does unfortunately increase the cost of care, but that's the price we have to pay. But invariably, if an instrument separates, we're medico-legally obligated to disclose that information to the patient. But since the meta-analysis of file separation has shown no significant difference in outcomes at this time, it is important to put that information in context. If you decide to monitor the broken instrument, make sure you emphasize the importance of follow-up. Instruments separate rarely, but how we handle it is the key to successful management of a patient. Making a proper triage by assessing the risk of removal versus the risk of leaving in place should always be combined with good follow-up, and we can make sure that our decisions were right for a given patient. In the final video of this series on the topic, I'm going to share some additional ideas and opinions on file separation. In my opinion, there are a few additional factors that influence the decision of retrieval or monitoring of a broken file in the canal. For example, instruments that break from cyclic fatigue are much easier to remove than those that break from excessive torque. Cyclic fatigue instruments are generally not engaged deep in the canal walls and only require a light amount of vibration in order to float out of the canal. Instruments that break due to excessive torque, on the other hand, are much harder to remove since they are heavily engaged in dentin. Design of a broken instrument is also a factor, as it changes room for bypassing and influence engagement of that file in the canal. Many experts at the podium show x-rays of instruments removal, but the audience doesn't realize the instrument separated from cyclic fatigue and so was totally loose in the canal. Such instruments are much easier to bypass or remove rather than those heavily engaged instruments. You see these types of failures globally in countries where files are used multiple times until they break, and this is the reason why such files come out much easier than a file that is broken in a super tight and curved canal and during reciprocation with an instrument that has a lot of land areas. At the end, remember this: file retrieval is an art, and you can indeed remove 100% of all broken instruments. It's just that you may not have enough tooth structure afterwards to save the tooth. So make sensible decisions for retrieval versus monitoring that considers your microsurgical skills or that of your endodontist, and try to decide by maximizing the long-term longevity biomechanically as well as microbiologically, instead of a panic-stricken decision to make a good-looking x-ray at the end of your procedure. Good luck to you in all of your instrument removals, but more importantly in avoiding instrument separations.